Hello again, everybody. So for this video, I'm going to go ahead and talk about what I would call the high water mark of liberal reform during the Johnson administration, which is something that all occurs in a really pretty remarkably short period of time between 1964 and 1965. This is one of the greatest kind of explosive periods of reformist energy in the United States in its entire history. Um, and it's a period that is, well, it's got kind of a mixed legacy, to be honest. Some of the reforms that are passed during this time period work very well, and to this day remain very, very popular. Other reforms that are enacted during this time period prove to be, both in the long and the short run, very controversial, in many cases, not entirely effective. And in the end, some of those programs end up providing sort of ammunition for an emerging cultural backlash that will eventually reshape American politics in the later part of the 1960s. So let's go ahead and dive into all that. So again, shortly after becoming president, after President John F. Kennedy's assassination, President Lyndon Johnson decides he wants to go big on domestic reform. As I mentioned previously, Johnson's entire political career was inspired by Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the New Deal. He had been elected to Congress the first time under the Roosevelt administration as a Democrat from the hill country of Texas. He idolized FDR to the point that he modeled his favorite nickname LBJ after what people called Franklin Roosevelt, FDR. So he has this very strong ambition to outdo his idol, Franklin Roosevelt, in and to basically build a reputation for himself as this great reformer in American history. And I think that were it not for his decisions on the Vietnam War, I think that there's a very real likelihood that that probably would be his legacy. But for reasons that I'll be getting into um, a little bit in this video, but much more extensively in later videos, that ends up largely not being the case. So let's start off with the first things that Johnson goes into. Johnson, as I mentioned just a moment ago, grew up poor in the Texas Hill Country, and so he was innately, um, familiar with poverty and how poverty affected the day-to-day lives of many people in his own communities and in the communities of millions of other peoples in the United States. Um, at the time he became president, although the United States was in the midst of still the midst of that massive post-war economic expansion, that massive economic boom that had begun in 1948 and which had continued more or less uninterrupted up till that point. Uh, the fact is that in spite of the expansion of the middle class, millions of Americans still lived in abject poverty and with lack of access to good jobs, good education, a variety of different things. And so one of the things that Johnson does when he takes the reins of power, one of the very first things that he does, in fact, in his 1964 and his 1964 State of the Union address, Johnson declares what he calls a quote unquote unconditional war on poverty. And so he lays out this incredibly ambitious domestic agenda to combat poverty and to reduce the rate of poverty in this country quite dramatically. Um, Ultimately, some of the programs that he enacts as part of that anti-poverty initiative work, others don't. And there's a couple of reasons why the war on poverty, in and of itself, becomes incredibly controversial as time goes on. Eventually, it'll become a millstone around the necks of Democrats for the better part of an entire generation, if not longer. Um, and a big part of that is because when it starts out, poverty is framed in universal terms by Johnson. When he declares an unconditional war on poverty, he's aiming to reduce poverty in, West Virginia and Eastern Kentucky as much as he is aimed at reducing poverty in the inner cities of Detroit and Philadelphia and Newark and places like that. So he frames this in very colorblind, neutral, universal terms. Um, but as time goes on, and in particular as the 1960s become a decade convulsed with the war, the effects of the war in Vietnam, the a series of urban riots, which I'll talk about in the next video, and uh, general white backlash to the successes of the civil rights movement, the issue of poverty itself will over time become racialized. People will stop thinking over time of poverty as a universal societal problem and come to think of it as, for the lack of a better way of putting it, as a black problem, as a minority problem. And once that occurs, opposition to anti-poverty programs will dramatically increase in the United States. But that's not the immediate cause of why some aspects of Johnson's war on poverty proved to be less than successful. Part of it is because Johnson, although he sought to outdo his idol Franklin Roosevelt, he wasn't willing to go as far as Roosevelt was in terms of taking the kind of massive restructuring of the American economy that combating poverty truly would have required. And so instead, the war on poverty largely takes the form of this very complex, um, bureaucracy riddled, and scattershot kind of approach to dealing with poverty. You have some programs that become part of this, like Head Start, that are successful, that seek to improve access to early childhood education and things like that. Um, but then you have other aspects of the program, most notably the Community Action Program, or CAP, that seeks to empower working poor communities to engage in what they call maximum feasible participation in the political process. Those end up becoming either basically slush funds for political machines in American cities, like, for example, Daley's Chicago, where that city's mayor essentially takes the federal funding that was meant for anti-poverty programs and community action programs and uses them to further oil his expansive and largely all-white political machine in that city. And then conversely, you have places like Newark, New Jersey, where community action programs end up being overtaken by Black Power activists who alienate a lot of mainstream supporters with their rhetoric and their actions. So one of the reasons why the war on poverty proves to be, in the long run, um, a mixed bag, partly, is because it lacks the structure. It lacks the organizational input necessary to effectively galvanize and organize the anti-poverty reduction in the United States. This is something that many civil rights activists actually themselves criticized it for, was that it was too scattershot, that it didn't go far enough, that many of its programs were poorly funded, and the people who staffed them were unqualified. So that ultimately will play into a narrative, perhaps best expressed by future President Ronald Reagan, that the war on poverty was a failure. He famously said in his 1984 State of the Union address, "We declared war on poverty, and poverty won." Um, Again, that's an oversimplification of what actually happened with Johnson's war on poverty. Um, Part of the reason it's less than completely successful is, again, because of that lack of a meaningful central organizing principle behind it. But another factor that contributes to the program's ultimate, if not failure, certainly it being less than completely successful, is that Johnson himself ends up diverting what little funding he does allocate for anti-poverty measures to fight a increasingly unpopular and increasingly losing war in Vietnam after 1965, 1966, which is kind of the major point of departure for a lot of this stuff. There's a reason why 1965 is both the high watermark of the civil rights movement and of liberal reform, and why it also marks really the beginning of the kind of downward trend in both of those movements in American society. But anyway, so that's part of the reason. In spite of all these factors, in spite of its lack of a central organizing principle, in spite of the fact that as time goes on, money is increasingly diverted from these programs to fight the war in Vietnam, by some metrics, the war on poverty is successful. The rate of people living in poverty in the United States decreases between 1965 and 1970 by as much as 40%. So there is an actual concrete reduction in the number of Americans living in poverty. It's not 100%, obviously, but it is significant. So that's definitely, I think, something that's worth considering about it. Now, ultimately, the war on poverty gets linked into and associated with a larger overarching goal of the Johnson administration. Johnson eventually advocates for what he calls a Great Society, which is this massive expansion of government programs, a revamping of civil rights, immigration laws, and a variety of other areas of American life that proves to be very transformational. And it's here where we see some of the more successful aspects of Johnson's domestic policy. One of the things that Johnson makes a major part of his Great Society programs is expanding access to education and increasing the federal government's role in education. To that end, there are two laws that are passed: the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965 and the Higher Education Act of 1965, which give the federal government a much more direct role in creating and really kind of standardizing the nation's education system, though many aspects of it still remain very, very highly localized, particularly with K through 12 stuff. It's much more impactful in higher education, frankly. But anyway, the result of this is a dramatic expansion of the number of colleges and universities and the number of college students in the United States. It's many of the commuter campuses of state universities, many of the community colleges that exist today can trace their origins to this time period. Places like UMSL or Merrimack or various others in the St. Louis area can trace their origins to around this period. And that's because of the increase in federal expenditures for education that allows for the building of those new campuses and those new commuter universities. So that's one thing that ends up having a largely positive impact. Though over time, the way that education is funded for students through federally subsidized student loans will, of course, present its own problems. But that's a topic for another day. At the time, many of these new universities are largely free, and that's because of the, again, still very high tax burden. But again, that's, we'll get more into that later when we get into later parts of American history of why education expenditures eventually get slashed and the cost of education ends up going through the roof after the 21st century begins. But anyway, in addition to dramatic increase in federal expenditures for education, perhaps the most impactful piece of legislation to come out of Johnson's Great Society, and certainly the most popular piece of legislation to come out of Johnson's Great Society, is the partial success in achieving the longstanding progressive goal of creating universal national health care. Now, going all the way back to Theodore Roosevelt's Progressive Party platform in 1912, and on the Democratic Party side, going back to Harry Truman in his 1948 Fair Deal, creating a national health care program had long been a priority of progressive activists in the United States. But those efforts had come up against sustained opposition from industry groups like the American Medical Association, as well as, of course, politically from the Republican Party, who attacked such programs as, socialized medicine, or, basically, leading us down the path towards socialism, towards communism. And so there's, again, that oftentimes very effective Cold War attack of trying to link the creation of a national healthcare program with the Soviet Union and with communism. But Johnson is able to at least partially succeed in this area where others had failed. And the way that he's able to do this is by reframing universal health care as an expansion of an existing program that's already very, very popular in the United States at this time period, Social Security. As part of his Great Society, Johnson proposes Medicare to provide health insurance to all Americans over the age of 65, and to give them guaranteed access to physicians and to medicine and basically all the things that come with, universal single-payer healthcare system. He also proposes a second part program that's oftentimes overlooked, but which is also very important, called Medicaid, which is designed to provide health care to the poor and indigent, particularly people who suffer physical or mental disabilities that prohibit them from work. And so both of these programs are enacted as part of his Great Society program, again, largely by linking them to a successful existing program. Now, the evidence is that after Medicare was adopted and was well received and successful, that Johnson probably intended eventually to try to expand it to everybody, not just the aged. But ultimately, like many other aspects of his domestic program, those efforts were eventually shelved as the Vietnam War increasingly occupied pretty much the entirety of Johnson's attention after 1965, 1966. So again, but still very successful and very popular with Americans of all political persuasions. So notably, even many modern day conservatives don't want to touch Medicare or Social Security, which is a testament to how successful and how popular those programs are. But the other major program that comes out of the Great Society that I want to mention is one that doesn't immediately prove to have massive impacts on American society, but over time, it is going to really, really play a big role in reshaping American society in ways that nobody could have intended at the time period. And that's in the area of immigration. Basically, in 1965, Johnson, as part of his Great Society program and part of his efforts to create a more inclusive American society, he scraps the old immigration laws that had been passed in the 1920s, which were designed to keep out Catholic and Jewish immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe by imposing a quota system on immigrants from specific countries. So he does away with that old, basically racist quota system that had been adopted in the 1920s and which had been pretty strongly enforced up until that point, even in the midst of the Holocaust. And he replaces it with a system, an immigration law, the Hart-Celler Act, or as it's also known, the Immigration Act of 1965, that opens immigration up on the basis of skills and needs, not national origin. Now, what this will mean over time, and what nobody could have expected at the time period, is that by the dawn of the 21st century, as a result of the Immigration Act of 1965, the majority of immigrants coming into the United States will be non-white. A large percentage will be Asian. A sizable percentage will be from Middle Eastern or um, African sources. And of course, by far the largest share of new immigrants coming to the US will be people coming from the Western Hemisphere, Latinos. Um, so the end effect of the Immigration Act of 1965 is eventually what many of today dubbed the Browning of America, making the United States a much less homogenized country than it had been for much of its history, with many more different ethnic backgrounds, religious backgrounds, etc. And of course, that in of itself creates political problems of its own, um, particularly because in the case of immigration from Latin America, the Immigration Act of 1965 imposed caps, which would eventually produce the unintended consequence of mass illegal immigration. So, these are all very, very consequential pieces of legislation. Again, some of them still very popular, like Medicare. Some of them not so much. And then, of course, other programs like the War on Poverty, kind of being a mixed bag of many different elements coming together. But overall, again, a very, very, um, broad set of reforms, and really one of the most, sustained and if contained periods of reform in American history. Of course, the most important element of this is the one that I haven't substantially mentioned in this video, which is the Great Society efforts to expand civil rights. We'll look into that fight and how it achieves its successes and how it ultimately begins to start unraveling in the next video.